Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 118 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is the podcast where I discuss current events related to foreign policy and international news and then give some analysis on those events. The show comes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, typically in the afternoon, but sometimes I'm ambitious and get out the show early in the morning for your commute to work. The show could be found at thelibertarianinstitute.org on the homepage, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or at the Facebook page, The Libertarian Union. I got a bunch of stories to talk about today, and I really want to focus quite a bit of analysis on the Syria issue and just where we're at with that. I think there's been several very significant stories that come out of Syria that I'd like to discuss, but I want to touch on a couple things going on that have been frequent topics on the show recently. The first of those being the Yemen and then the Yemen House resolution, originally HCON Res 81, which I was, really pushing everybody to support and call their congressman for, because supporting that would have invoked the War Powers Act and would have ended the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's war against the people of Yemen, specifically the Houthi Saleh and the people of Northern Yemen. Unfortunately, the Rules Committee destroyed that bill, and I believe we ended up with the House Resolution 599, I believe is what it was, but it may have been a different one. Just Google Yemen vote if you're interested in looking. And Congress ends up voting 360 to 30 with a lot of abstentions, I guess, what would be in favor of a resolution non-binding that really does nothing but says that Congress didn't authorize more or less the intervention in Yemen. It doesn't acknowledge that the U.S. Congress would have had to, and have a declaration of war or an authorization of use of military force. It just says that we haven't explicitly put our stamp of approval on this, but I think many people interpret that to obviously mean that we don't have to. So, I guess this is a step in the right direction. If you would have asked me a couple months ago if we could just have a symbolic vote in the House on the war in Yemen, that carries some significance, and I would have loved to see that happen. However, with all the support and all the co-sponsors, I believe the bill was up to like 40 co-sponsors when they killed it. With all that going on, we are really making some headway on that HCON Res 81. We're kind of getting to that point where, maybe something really good could happen here, or at least maybe the, state kind of has to expose itself as just, war hungry, and it could be exposed to the American people that Congress absolutely has no control on the executive's war powers. However, we continue with the facade and we pretend like Congress did something that really doesn't matter. While the House debated and voted on the war, on a, meaningless bill on the war on Yemen, members or people in Yemen, like the Houthis, were actually dying. In Yemen right now, we have the absolute starvation of Northern Yemen. Saudi Arabia has closed off the ports in Northern Yemen and the airport in Sana'a completely from humanitarian aid. I guess this is because, what I heard Nasser Arabi say on the Scott Horton show was Saudi Arabia is accusing Iran of smuggling the missile that, was actually a Yemeni designed missile made in Yemen and then fired at the Riyadh airport, but that the United States and Saudi Arabia fictionally say was given to the Yemen Houthis by Iran. That was actually smuggled into Yemen by the Iranians through bags of flour, which is completely ridiculous. Obviously, you couldn't smuggle an ICBM in a bunch of bags of flour. This is absolutely insane. And so, but because nobody, reads past the headlines, what this ends up being is just people understanding that, the Iranians are allied with the Houthis and the Iranians gave the Houthis a missile and they use that to shoot at Saudi Arabia. And I think the most important point here is that this is not really a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And making it a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran is somehow justifying the genocide of the Yemeni people. Nasser Arabi talked about at least 50,000. He feels like he could confirm that 50,000 people have died from direct fighting in Yemen. These are people that were killed by bombs or by shooting at each other since the war started, I believe, late March of 2015, and then countless others have either starved to death or succumbed from cholera. Of course, I know this isn't the most pleasant thing to hear, but it's this is the reality for the people of Yemen, is that when you have cholera, you don't die because of a high fever. You die because you dehydrate yourself and lose all of your fluids, vomiting and diarrheaing yourself until you die. And people are dying of this in Yemen, right? Like, there's people who live in remote villages. They have Saudi Arabia bomb whatever water treatment facility provides them with water. They then drink dirty water. One person gets cholera. It spreads to the rest of the people in the village. And there's, no real great sanitation. They can't get to hospitals because all the roads have been destroyed. There's no fuel because Saudi Arabia isn't allowing fuel in the country. The aid groups either can't or just don't have the supplies to operate in the more remote areas of Yemen because Saudi Arabia won't allow more supplies into the country. Also, Saudi Arabia isn't allowing the, workers of Yemen, the people who work for the state of Yemen, to receive their salaries if they live in northern Yemen. And so, people who are, in positions formerly employed by the state, teachers, nurses, doctors, and as a free market guy, I obviously have my problem with this, but this is the way the whole system was set up. So by Saudi Arabia taking away the money provided from the government to the people, it's really created a situation where all these kind of industries have in a lot of ways started to collapse. These people have been without pay for 18 months, and so it's held together for a very long time, but I think it's at the point where so many people in Yemen, you read these heartbreaking stories where families are forced to choose. Do you buy food for, some children, or do you take the other children to the hospital to get them treatment? You can't afford to do both, and, doing one or the other really may not save anybody or make a difference. But, you're choosing between your children's medical care and their food. And while this would be something, that maybe in the most extreme of circumstances is something that occurs in the West and, in the United States, it's really a daily occurrence in Saudi Arabia now, and something that millions of people are facing. We also have Saudi airstrikes in northern Yemen, killing 29 people at a market. So Nasser Arabi did a good job in the interview discussing this case. We have 47 people died, I believe, in Aden, which is the port city in southern Yemen where the Saudi government has now declared the capital. I think Hadi is there under house arrest by Saudi Arabia. A lot of the fighting force used by this government is made up of either Al-Qaeda or ISIS fighters. And so there are occasional terror attacks in the southern port cities. There's been a couple huge ones that have actually targeted the, mercenaries in Yemen who are collecting paychecks from Saudi Arabia for their fighting. And this one apparently had targeted some kind of local police facility, killed 47 people. We also have Saudi Arabia bombing the Yemeni airport in northern Yemen. This will certainly inhibit aid from being able to reach, northern Yemen more efficiently, even as, Saudi Arabia may decide that the blockade is lifted. This is permanent damage to the infrastructure of Yemen that's going to cause people to starve and die, moving forward into the future. We have a story that I think is getting a lot more play than it deserves, and that is this big breaking piece in the Atlantic that apparently WikiLeaks colluded with the Trump administration. Now, of course, this all fits into the Russia hacked the election narrative, while this part of the story has absolutely nothing to do with Russia whatsoever. Donald Jr., to his credit, posted all of his conversations with, WikiLeaks on Twitter and was like, look, this is what happened. A lot of the outrage from the story came with I guess, a particular message when WikiLeaks said to Donald Jr., hey, give us your dad's tax returns and this will help, both us and you, because people are ignoring the DNC and Podesta tweets because they say WikiLeaks is just going after Hillary Clinton. And so that was all that was written in the Atlantic piece. And it didn't acknowledge or didn't even suggest that there was more to that message that was sent from WikiLeaks to Donald Jr. And that is that this is a line that the DNC is using both against Donald Trump and against WikiLeaks, is that they were saying to everybody, hey, don't believe this, WikiLeaks are just Trump plans. I think if anything that this string of messages be from WikiLeaks to the Trump campaign actually makes WikiLeaks look a little bit worse than the Trump campaign. Basically what I feel like you had here is WikiLeaks just fishing for information. I think I've heard several people say that Don Jr. is the less bright of the, Trump offspring, especially if you include the son-in-law Jared Kushner. So, maybe WikiLeaks really thought they were going to dupe poor Don Jr. into giving up his dad's tax returns. It doesn't seem like there's really anything more to this. It certainly doesn't prove any Russia collusion or any collusion of any kind. I'll link to a very good, I believe, Mediaite article that really goes through and details how selective editing is what the Atlantic used to blow this story way out of proportion. we have another story that's probably getting a little bit more attention than it needs, but I will mention it, and that is 23 European countries signed a binding agreement of some kind where they all, I guess, are going to agree to spend more money on defense and then, target military integration. So Germany, I guess the UK and France are all going to work to build a new missile or whatever else. I guess that was a bad example at the start, because one of the countries I was going to mention that explicitly wasn't in the deal was the UK, which is significant because UK, I believe, has like the 7th highest, defense budget in the world. I don't think this yet is a European army that everybody really has been talking about. And I think the bigger risk to that is just that all these European countries would give more to NATO. More European defense spending is, also a way maybe this is a cover for the European countries to try to be, kissing up to Trump a little bit while this story hasn't really been discussed in the Trump lens. This has certainly been a very huge talking point of the whole Trump administration, and that was that Europe needs to spend more on their own defense. A couple stories out of North Korea. First, we have North Korea sending a letter to the UN about U.S. aggression, and I think this is something that, I could just take the time to, again, update how much U.S. firepower is directed at North Korea. Of course, we now have the THAAD missile batteries in South Korea, and the United States is looking to put more there. There's also THAAD batteries in Taiwan, and the U.S. has several assets in Taiwan as well as in Japan. The United States has a aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, based in Japan, and we also just had the Wilson and the Nimitz both in the Pacific. And so if you look at it and you see that, well, right at this time, the U.S. had the B-1B bombers in Guam. We have the 52s on 24-hour alert and always ready to take off and drop a nuclear bomb on North Korea. We have 3 aircraft carriers as well as countless other ships from the U.S., Japan, and South Korean navies. And all these THAAD missile batteries all surrounding North Korea, and with Donald Trump making threats towards North Korea. And so while I'm certainly not somebody who is in any way sympathetic towards the North Korean government, if you just look at this from the North Korean perspective real quick, it's no surprise that they feel like they need nuclear weapons, right? Because what's essentially going on here is that the United States has all these guns pointing at North Korea, and the only thing North Korea has to defend itself is the nuclear weapons. We also have a North Korea soldier apparently making a very daring escape to escape North Korea across the DMZ and reach the South Korean lines. He apparently took a bullet both in the hip and in the shoulder, but as far as the story I read, I think on Tuesday, he was still alive. So that was pretty interesting, and I don't know if the guy will have anything particularly interesting to say or whatever, but, good for him for escaping the, hellhole of the North. Michael Malice, who is quite the expert on communist states, and I believe he's even took a tour of North Korea at one time, and of course is the author of the unauthorized biography of Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, has talked about how, if somebody is able to defect in North Korea, their whole extended family may be killed or put in a slave camp. So, this is a terrible, terrible state. The North Korean regime is absolutely awful, and Kim Jong-un is one of the worst and most dangerous people on the planet. However, I think a lot of his power comes from the U.S. hostilities against North Korea, because the North Korean people also have all those weapons pointing at their heads. It's not just pointed at the North Korean government, and Trump has made this very clear, that millions of North Koreans will die alongside Kim Jong-un if the United States decides to go to war with North Korea. And so just like the North Korean government, the North Korean civilians are put in a position where the only thing stopping them from getting killed by the United States is the nuclear weapons. I just want to update the earthquake on the Iraq-Iran border. Apparently 530 have now been killed in that earthquake. Those are the latest death tolls from Iran. It's an absolute tragedy, and it's really unfortunate, but this many people are dying in the Middle East all the time from all these war efforts and everything else going on. When it's a natural disaster, the media seems to pay more attention to it just because they could go, well, yeah, they could blame all these, kind of imaginary targets, but when it would, be something like Saudi Arabia killing 200 something Yemenis in a funeral, then, they have nothing to say, because then there's a, clear way to stop this, which is just for Saudi Arabia to stop bombing. In Israel, we have the Israelis apparently expanding settlements, and they're going to destroy another Palestinian village, displacing 300 people. The slow destruction of Palestine continues, and it is so sad to watch. Of course, this is something that's, constantly happened where we have these settlement expansions in the West Bank, and they just, month by month, week by week, they take, one more home, 20 more homes, whatever, and displace this many more Palestinian people and expand Israeli territory that much more. Alright, so what I want to talk about in Syria is as we're getting a little bit of thoughts that maybe the Syrian Civil War is winding down and maybe we may have some sort of resolution. And this is largely because of the defeat of the Islamic State in Syria. The war has been pretty hot in Syria recently, but I think that's largely because there was an enemy that everybody could pick on without, sparking too many geopolitical problems. Everybody was kind of free to take as much ground from ISIS as they wanted. Most of the time, there were some times like around Al-Tanf where the US was bombing Assad-backed forces in order to prevent them from taking territory from ISIS. However, generally everybody was allowed to attack ISIS at will. This meant that the war could go on for several years without Russia ever really coming into, all that much contact with the United States, and for Syria really never to have to fight against US-backed or Kurdish troops. However, now we're at a position where that enemy and that, bank that everybody has been relying on to kind of stave off any further communications or talks is now up. Now both the United States, Trump, and Russians have all kind of said that they're okay with the Geneva process, which I believe was to hold elections that Assad will probably win and allow Assad to stay in power. However, there's a whole lot more going on, and I kind of think that this war isn't even close to being over. So we have Israel, who for a while has been threatening Iran/Hezbollah presence in Syria, but has made this much more blatant in recent days. It is kind of concerning. So Israel has been willing to hit has been willing to drop airstrikes in Syria at Hezbollah targets for some time. Sometimes I think hitting just straight up Syrian targets. But I guess for the Syrians up to this point, at least, it has always been kind of acceptable losses, and rather than pick a fight with Israel, let them carry out 150 airstrikes or so across the Syrian Civil War. Now, Israel is saying that there cannot be any Iranian or Hezbollah troops left in Syria when this is all said and done for some time. However, now they're saying that we're going to enforce this with our own forces if needed. And so this is really concerning because the Israelis, is at least for a large part of how they fought the Civil War, have, carried out with the threats they made. And so this is going to cause a real problem, especially because the Russians say, well, no, we're okay with the Iranians staying. They're a legitimate force in Syria. They're invited there. I've made the point before that Assad does not have enough power to control all of Syria. And for him to do that, he's going to have to rely on foreign forces loyal to him, including Hezbollah, Iran, and Shia militias, from Iraq and various other places. So unless Russia wants to make up that difference with their own troops and their own occupation, then, somebody's going to have to be there. And I think Russia's more than willing to let it to be, be the militias, the Iranians, and the, Lebanese over Russian troops themselves. We have Erdogan making another pretty legitimate threat against the Kurds. Turkey has long insisted that their position in the Syrian Civil War is that the Kurds cannot be west of the Euphrates River. Now, for a long time, this has not been the case, and in fact, in the town of Manbij, U.S. troops are routinely driving around in between the Kurdish and the Turkish-backed militaries in order to prevent them from shooting at each other. Unless the United States is willing to put our boys in between these two enemy forces in perpetuity, eventually this is, gonna really become a problem. Also, there's a large Kurdish enclave, I believe in the Aleppo province of Syria, known as Afrin. And that, is far west of any other Kurdish positions. And now the Turkish army has really surrounded that as part of the deal set up between all the parties of the Syrian Civil War. Turkish troops are going into the deconfliction zone in Idlib, I guess with the idea of demilitarizing and getting rid of the more Islamist factions there and replacing them with, first Turkish troops and then moderate Syrian rebels. That's a complete pipe dream like the moderate rebels have always been. But that's the general plan that's supposed to legitimize the Turkish presence in Syria. But what it looks like Turkey is actually going to do in Syria is try to take Afrin back from the Kurds. Erdogan suggested that the Russians red-lighted this one, or green-lighted this one, meaning that, the Turks were a go to take on the Kurds there if they wanted to. I'm not sure if, maybe some kind of deal will be worked out. Will the Kurds will give up that area or not? But, it's going to be interesting. I think the Kurds have really expanded into Aleppo, even the city proper itself, from this Afrin area. We have the Syrian government renewing statements, telling the United States to get the hell out of our country. With ISIS gone, the United States' at least stated excuse to be there is now gone. However, I think we have General Mattis telling us that, U.S. troops are going to remain in Syria to prevent the potential rise of an ISIS 2.0. I'm guessing that, at least from the perspective of the Trump administration, what could possibly cause an ISIS 2.0 is Arab Muslims existing in Syria. So it seems like this means that U.S. troops will be forever in Syria in order to prevent any ISIS from ever forming again. Of course, we have the coming conflict or, some negotiations between Assad and not only the Syrian rebels, but the jihadist Syrian rebels that still control areas down near the Israeli border, near the Lebanon border, in South Syria on the Jordan border near Al-Tanf, where they're backed by the United States, and in the Idlib province of Syria. All these rebels, will eventually either have to, give up their guns or form some kind of legitimate militia, maybe join the Syrian army. I'm not sure how it's all going to work out, but this could mean that the Syrian army just goes through and kills them all. We've seen that Russia and Syria are willing to be just as indiscriminate with their bombings as the United States and Saudi Arabia, and are willing to kill people, 50 at a time in places in Syria. And so, there could be a lot of death and destruction to come to the people of Syria. And while it may seem like the, civil war in Syria is winding down, I think it's very, very far from over. So the other big story I want to talk about in Syria is this story put out by the BBC. Of course, this story was first reported by Moon of Alabama and discussed on my show, I believe in the middle of October. And this is the United States and SDF forces agreeing to a ceasefire or surrender deal with ISIS fighters in Raqqa. Now, towards the middle of October, ISIS in Raqqa is down to just a little portion of the old city. They're surrounded. The United States is carrying out pretty indiscriminate airstrikes that are killing ISIS fighters as well as, bundles of civilians, including the family of ISIS fighters at a time. The ceasefire terms allowed 275 Islamic State fighters and their family members and apparently their weapons leave Raqqa and go to Deir ez-Zor, Syria. The convoy was apparently 6 to 8 kilometers long and included top ISIS officials as well as foreign fighters. Now, the first problem this presents for the Trump administration is Donald Trump himself has long said, we're just going to kill everybody around ISIS and that'll be how it is because that's how we're going to get rid of ISIS. And Mattis had announced that the United States was carrying out an annihilation strategy against ISIS, which means once we trap them in these population centers, we're going to kill them all until, nobody is left standing. But this is the exact opposite of this. In fact, when ISIS surrendered on the Lebanon-Syrian border and attempted to travel through the Syrian desert to Deir ez-Zor in a surrender negotiated between the Syrian government and Hezbollah and ISIS, the United States said that they couldn't do it, that they couldn't make a deal with ISIS, and carried out airstrikes that prevented this convoy from reaching Deir ez-Zor for quite a long time. Of course, some of these ISIS fighters have allegedly attempted to escape Syria, some making it as far as the Syrian border. I guess it's, unknown if some people are actually able to escape. Some have been apprehended in Jordan. But this is quite a big deal. One of the reasons that this story got exposed is that the United States hired some Syrian drivers. I guess it's very difficult to travel through the Syrian desert. And it's even, 20 times more difficult to do it in the middle of the Syrian Civil War when Russia and the United States are dropping bombs and there's all these different factions that have all these different checkpoints that you gotta go through. And so there's a real, way to have to navigate these kind of things. And so the United States hired these, Syrian drivers to drive all these ISIS fighters from Raqqa to Deir ez-Zor. The United States ended up stiffing the drivers and not paying them, including some drivers who are pretty upset because their apparently, fancy raids got beat up and dinged up carrying all the heavy ISIS weapons. So, they're more than willing to talk. They explain how the United States didn't tell them that they were transporting ISIS. They were supposed to just be transporting some, I guess, U.S. weapons with the cover of the United States. And suddenly, ISIS Jihad 101 hops in the passenger seat of his truck with a suicide belt on and says, let's go. If we run into any problems, I'm blowing the whole thing up. Man, I would be really, really, really upset at the U.S. government if I were put in that position by them. I mean, so other than what should be a huge scandal that the United States essentially aided ISIS here and allowed them to escape Raqqa, is that this is at least being perceived by some analysts as a deal between the United States and ISIS to allow the United States and backed SDF forces take the Al-Omar oil fields around Deir ez-Zor, Syria. Now, it looked for a long time to me that the Syrian government was far ahead of the United States government in making gains against ISIS towards the Al-Omar oil fields. But suddenly the United States backed forces were able to take those fields from ISIS. So this has at least created speculation, and somewhat legitimate speculation. I mean, imagine if it happened the other way around, that the United States cut a deal with ISIS to get their hands on those oil fields. And I'm sure this is rubbing a lot of people in Russia and in Syria, especially supporters of the Syrian government, the wrong way. And so, this could create some trust issues between those two groups in the time to come, and could really make the Syrian government not want to deal with the U.S. government when it comes to trying to work on, who's going to control what territory in Syria as they try to wind the war down. In Afghanistan, we have the Taliban, I think on Sunday night, carrying out a total of 15 attacks against Afghan police posts, killing 27 Afghan police forces. In Libya, we have CNN with a big story about there being slave trade in Libya. I've talked about this for a long time, but CNN has video of people being auctioned off. Absolutely terrible. Libya may be a worse place to live than Yemen at times, because we have water being weaponized in Libya. In Libya, all the water really comes from the south of the country, and Gaddafi built these extremely expensive pipelines that go north. So now I guess some of these tribes in southern Libya have a ton of control over what goes on in Tripoli and in, northern Libya, because, they could literally, shut off the water. Nobody in Tripoli has clean water. And I guess this happened at one time for them to be able to free somebody who was fighting against the government in Tripoli but was a member of one of these southern tribes. In Mali, we have 2 Navy SEALs apparently killing a Green Beret. It's likely that the Green Beret discovered that the Navy SEALs were more or less embezzling some money that was meant to be paid to informants. When the Beret found out, the SEALs offered to cut him in. He said no, and so they killed him. They initially said that they were combat training and the guy had a drinking problem and he was drunk and he ended up dying in the combat training, but that's obviously not what happened because he wasn't drinking at the time. In Somaliland, we have them holding presidential elections. Somaliland is a breakaway area of Somalia. And in other African news, and kind of the big story that's developing now in Zimbabwe, we have the military going to the capital of Zimbabwe and then I guess imprisoning now the president and his wife. I'll have definitely more information on this on Friday's show. I know the president there is like this 93-year-old guy, Mugabe. He's kind of a notorious war criminal who has done some terrible things. Zimbabwe is a country that's faced terrible inflation and terrible policies by the president. His wife, of course, has enjoyed a very luxurious wife and is often seen as a very corrupt person, and I think is actually sanctioned by European countries. So I guess, kind of pay attention to see how things develop there over the next couple of days, and I'll have some updates on Friday's show. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. For those of you who like this show, you should check out the Liberty Weekly podcast, hosted by my friend Patrick. Great guy. He had me on his show, episode 41. You can find the episode at the Libertarian Union. And, see what it's like for somebody to interview me. Sometimes I interview people on the show. Usually it's just me talking, but, I think the interview format was fun. I had a great time on the show. I really appreciate him for having me on. Hopefully, maybe a couple new listeners come over because of the show. So if you like it, check it out. We talked mostly about the Saudi Arabia situation and kind of just all the players in the Middle East and what's going on there. You could, of course, find my podcast and Patrick's podcast, Liberty Weekly, at the Libertarian Union Facebook page. It's an awesome group of ANCAP and Libertarian podcasts featuring, Actual Anarchy, Liberty Weekly, Don't Waste Your Hate, and Kenny the Wizard's podcast. I think it's Wizardly Wisdom. I've been on that podcast a few times. We used to co-host the podcast. I should really remember Kenny's stuff. So you can either share my show from there, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or at thelibertarianinstitute.org. It's on the homepage there. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Sorry about rambling on in the closing notes. I'll be back on Friday.